The following is a video recording of a virtual workshop on understanding racism, held on Sunday, October 25th, 2020. It is the first in a four-part series on racism and systemic bias presented by the Interfaith Communities for Dialogue, or ICD. We join as the session is being introduced.
I'm also glad that Fazia Dean, an ICD steering committee member, is serving as the facilitator. Fazia is from Guyana. She studied in Canada and the US, is a lawyer by training, and is the Deputy Outreach Director at 𝐲𝐵𝗲𝗀𝗏 Islamic Center in Falls Church, Virginia. She is always challenging racism, specializes in interfaith community outreach and civic engagement. Her advocacy for equity, justice, and fairness has led her to mentorship and life coaching for women and teens, particularly in the surrounding communities of Washington, D.C. For ICD, Fazia is co-leading the working group on racism with Judith Shamir, who's another member of the ICD steering committee. So Fazia will introduce Camara Jones and then explain the ground rules for the workshop today. So I'll stop here and Fazia will take over. Thank you very much. Welcome again. Fazia, please carry on.
Oh, yes. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm tasked with moderating today, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Pammy. I don't know myself sometimes. So happy to be here. I'm just wondering if I should introduce Camara first or go through the ground rules. And I believe I'll just do the ground rules first. So for everyone, can everyone hear me?
Yep. How can you tell? Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Procedures and ground rules are very, very simple. A lot of us have been to Interfaith Communities for Dialogue before and we're familiar with them, but there might be some new people and we welcome those new people. So here we go. What do you need to know about procedures and ground rule? Please keep your microphone on mute and avoid disruption, because sometimes in the back you might have a door opening, and some of us have been zoomed out already. We know a lot of these technical difficulties. So keep your microphone on mute. You are encouraged but not required to keep your video on. However, we love to see your face, and it would be great if you keep your camera on as well. The presentation will consist of 3 segments and each followed by a Q&A period. The workshop is being recorded. So for those of you that are shy, we just wanted you to know that it's being done for the purpose, and it's for ICD's purposes, and it will be shared on our Facebook and other platforms. Other things about ground rules are just active listening, because the Q&A, it's going to be a brilliant time for you to ask your questions, and suspend any judgments when you're listening to any responses or any defensiveness. And embrace humble listening and learning. Put your personal assumptions and viewpoints aside. Assume positive intent. And I know we're all capable of that. And then some other things about the questions and comments. We want you to engage. And that's why there's 3 periods of pause where we will have discussion, enter questions and brief comments in the chat section. And if you don't know where the chat section is, if you look at the bottom of the Zoom page, everybody can see that little chat area, and you could just put your questions in there, and Judith will be monitoring that as well. Judith will share with the facilitator, which is me, those questions when it's appropriate for us to ask them. Now, when you're sharing or writing comments, be respectful and consider your words, how your words might be received. There might be some times where, if time allows, we might engage in some comments. So please be respectful. Again, thank you again for joining us today. We're so happy you're here this afternoon. And with that, further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker. I'm excited about this, and I'm glad that I'm introducing her. If you give me a second. What happened to the page? Right here. Sorry, Camara, I'm getting there. All right. So our guest today, 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐝, a doctor, a family physician, and epidemiologist whose work focuses on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. She is a past president of the American Public Health Association and was the 2019 to 2020 Evelyn Green Davis Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. She has taught at Harvard School of Public Health, Morehouse School of Medicine, and Rollins School of Public Health, and served as the medical officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Her allegories, Her allegories on race and racism illuminate topics that are otherwise difficult for many Americans to understand or discuss. Recognizing that racism saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. She aims to mobilize and engage all Americans in a national campaign against racism. And I just wanted to add one more thing I found out about her today, is that she is the eldest of 3 sisters, and they're all doctors. Welcome, Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much, Fazia. Thank you, Pammy. Thank you, Judith. Thank you all for inviting me to launch this 4-part workshop series on racism. So I'm going to be sharing my screen, and I am very interested. This is my first introduction to you all as Interfaith Communities for Dialogue, and I don't even know how many other such communities there are around the country, but I'm very impressed even with the fact that you guys have been together for however, I don't know if it was 6 years or 16 years. It's really, really a delight to know that you're even in dialogue together. This first workshop, I framed as Understanding Systemic Racism. And we're going to have the conversation in 3 parts. So the first part is basically about understanding the dimensions of our work. You know, I'm a physician, I'm an epidemiologist. I'm going to give you a framework to understanding levels of health intervention, but that could be levels of educational intervention or housing intervention or community development intervention or whatever the kind of hands on the wheel work that each of your communities is doing in addition to the faith leadership that you're doing. So this is going to help us understand why anti-racism is a legitimate part of all of our work. And you guys are already there because you're launching this 4-part workshop, but maybe not every single individual is like clearly there or could explain it to somebody else. So this is the first framework. Then we will have a pause. Then I'm going to give you some tools for naming racism. So I'll give you one of my allegories, dual reality. I'll define racism. I'll describe racism on 3 levels. And then in that segment with another one of my allegories, the gardener's tale, and we'll take a pause. And then I'll give you tools for moving to action. So yes, it's very important for us to name racism. It's key. It's the first step, but it's insufficient. Necessary, but insufficient. So I'll talk about 3 tasks in a national campaign against racism. I'll give you tools for asking and identifying levers of intervention by asking the question, how's racism operating here? I will actually, for this group, it's an amazing group for me to try out kind of the edge of my work now, which is identifying the values targets for anti-racism action. I will love to have your input there. And then close with what can we do today? Kind of just some themes for moving to action. So here we are with my cliff analogy, which I often use if I'm either speaking to health professionals, so I call it levels of health intervention, or if I'm just speaking to a general audience and I want to have them understand and not freak out when I say the word racism. Here we go. Whoops, boom. Somebody just fell off the cliff of good health. And if that were you or somebody in your family, you would be delighted to find an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff to speed you on to care. But if we were concerned about other people who might come along that cliff face, so if we were concerned about population health or public health or community health, we might well ask ourselves, what could we put in place as a health intervention besides just stationing lots of ambulances at the bottom of the cliff? So somebody's going to say, I know, we need to put a net halfway down, right? That way, even if people fall, we could catch them before they get crunched up at the bottom. That's a great idea. Although the more you think about it, nets do have holes in them, so some people might fall through the cracks. But never mind that, we could actually make that a trampoline halfway down, no holes in a trampoline. But even if we had a trampoline halfway down that cliff, we might well find ourselves with lots of people just bouncing up and down at half functionality, not able to get back to the top of the cliff. So what else could we put in place as a health intervention? Well, we should be thinking about a fence at the edge of the cliff, right? To keep people from falling in the first place. But even that fence has to be a very, very strong fence if there's a lot of population pressure against it. So what else could we do as a health intervention? Well, we could move the population away from the edge of the cliff. So let me label the interventions. And of course, this could be health interventions, housing interventions, educational interventions, all kinds of interventions, justice interventions. And I don't know what your different congregations or communities might be doing in terms of the work. But with regard to health, let me label these different interventions where the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff represents acute medical care, and what we on the public health side of things describe as tertiary prevention. So in public health, we do talk about 3 levels of prevention: primary, secondary, tertiary, where tertiary prevention is preventing the complications from disease that's already manifest. So preventing amputations from diabetes and the like. That's your ambulance. The net or trampoline halfway down, these are our safety net programs, often in social services, often provided by congregation, religious, communities and the like, as well as secondary prevention, which is early detection, screening programs, which could be in communities like breast cancer screening in communities, or in clinical settings like prostate cancer screening and the like. That's your net or trampoline. The fence at the edge of the cliff is primary prevention, keeping bad things from happening in the first place, like immunizations, so a vaccine, and everybody's so focused right now on COVID-19 vaccine, so that would be an example, or policy intervention. So maybe a tobacco 21 policy, a policy that aims to prevent easy access of young people to tobacco products would be another example of a fence. And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff is what we on the health side of things describe as addressing the social determinants of health. So these are the determinants of health and illness that are outside of the individual, beyond our individual genes, beyond our individual behaviors. These are the context of our lives, and they include individual context, so individual education, occupation, income, wealth. So addressing poverty is a very important way of moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. They include neighborhood context, so the quality of housing, the availability of green space, the cleanliness of the air or the water, the availability of good schools, the availability of jobs, or even if there aren't jobs right there, is there transportation to a job? The food access, and whether you live in a so-called food desert or what some people have described as fast food swamps, can you get fresh fruits and vegetables easily, of high quality at a reasonable price? So all of these things, addressing adverse neighborhood conditions would be another way of moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. So if you were thinking about an outcome like infant mortality, that's the number of our babies dying before their first birthday, we would say, yeah, we need some of all of it. We want some ambulances, nets, fences, populations, and the ambulance in that case might be our neonatal intensive care units, and the net or trampoline might be prenatal care, so which is screening pregnant women for early identification of problems in the pregnancy. The fence might be excellent maternal nutrition. So maybe our WIC programs, women, infant, children programs, and maybe you all even have, food programs for pregnant or all kinds of people who might find themselves hungry. Moving the population away from the edge of the cliff might be a living wage, or it might be excellent educational opportunities so that young girls didn't feel that their main option in life was to have a baby too soon. So you see that not only could you depict different levels of health intervention with a given health outcome, but you could go into a community right? And we could all go and we could say, how much should we be spending on ambulances versus nets versus fences versus moving the population? How should we be distributing our health resources? So in that way, this diagram is quite useful, but as good as it could be, you know, I like it. I developed it when I was in New Zealand in 1999, trying to understand Maori health interventions. As I have presented it so far, it has a huge fatal flaw. And the huge fatal flaw is that this diagram does not yet equip us to talk about how health disparities arise, or educational disparities, or housing disparities, or any of the disparities that we see in this nation. And so I want you to put the cliff in the back of your mind for just a moment. We're going to shift gears to talk about how health disparities arise on 3 levels, and then we'll come back to the cliff. So how do disparities arise? Well, we recognize, first of all, that there are many axes of disparity. So there are disparities by race and ethnicity, which have a very long, persistent history in our nation and occur across age groups and occur across organ systems. We have disparities by urban, rural. We have disparities by religion. We have disparities by language group, immigration status, like this. But especially when we're talking about racial ethnic health disparities, we unfortunately have lots of evidence about differences in the quality of care received within the healthcare system. And in 2002, which is now 18 years ago, the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, released its unequal treatment report, which documented, pulling together hundreds of studies, that even for people in the same healthcare system, so everybody in the VA system, everybody covered by Medicare or Medicaid, there were very well documented disparities, differences in the quality of care by race or ethnicity. For example, differences in how vigorously your chest pain might be investigated or treated depending on your race, or differences in how much pain medication you might get if you walked into an emergency department with a long bone fracture, depending on your ethnicity or race. Very well documented differences in the quality of care received within our healthcare system. But that IOM panel recognized that that was not the end all and be all of how racial ethnic health disparities arise, because they said, we recognize we're limiting ourselves to people who are already in the healthcare system, but some people can't access healthcare in the first place. So that's a second level at which health disparities arise, differences in access to healthcare, both curative and preventive healthcare. But now I'm hoping that all of us listening right now recognize that health is not created within the health sector. So there's a third level at which health disparities arise, which are differences in the conditions of our lives, differences in our life opportunities, exposures, resources, and risks, which are making some individuals and communities sicker than others in the first place. And if we were to think about these 3 levels in which health disparities arise, differences in quality of care, differences in access to care, differences in underlying exposures and opportunities. And if we were to try to contextualize the importance of each of these, we might try to draw it as a pyramid, or actually, better yet, understand it as an iceberg where the huge hidden base are the differences in the conditions of our lives. And then very often the same people who have been made sicker are frustrated because of limited access to the healthcare system. And then sometimes even the lucky ones who access the healthcare system are further injured because of differences in quality of care. So remembering those 3 levels at which health disparities arise, we're going to go back to the cliff, but now we're going to recognize that we're actually not dealing with a flat 2-dimensional cliff. We are actually dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff. And at some parts of the cliff, there might be an ambulance there, but maybe that ambulance has a flat tire, so it's slow or goes off in the wrong direction. Or maybe there's no ambulance there at all, and maybe there's no net nor fence, and usually at those parts of the cliff, the population is being pushed closer to the edge. So now let me label these observations about the 3-dimensional cliff with how health disparities arise, where differences in quality of care when there's an ambulance there, but it's slower, goes off in the wrong direction. Differences in access to care, no ambulance, no net, no fence, and differences in underlying exposures and opportunities are represented by the closer proximity of that greeny population to the edge. So now that we recognize that we're really dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff, and it's 3-dimensional, as I keep saying, not just for health outcomes, but it's 3-dimensional for education, housing, justice, environmental, all of these outcomes. Now that we recognize that we're really dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff, there's a whole new set of questions that arise. The first, of course, being, how did the cliff become three-dimensional in the first place? And that's usually because of historical injustices that are perpetuated by present-day contemporary structural factors. But given that the cliff is three-dimensional, we need to ask, why are there differences in how resources are distributed along that cliff face? And why are there differences in who's found at different parts of the cliff? Why are the oranges back there in a way and the greenies being pushed closer to the edge? And when we start asking and addressing those kinds of questions, we are doing something that differs from addressing the social determinants of health, which I describe as moving the population away from the edge of the cliff, addressing poverty, adverse neighborhood conditions, and the like. When we start addressing, acknowledging and addressing systems of power that can differentially distribute resources and populations, we are addressing now the social determinants of equity or inequity, which include racism, sexism, heterosexism, economic systems like capitalism and the like. So that actually with this cliff analogy, I have distilled, if you will, 3 different dimensions of health intervention. So if you go back to your junior high or high school geometry, 1 dimension is a line, 2 dimensions is a flat plane, 3 dimensions is space. Well, along that line at the edge of the cliff is where we can display all of our curative and preventive health services right there. And if you say the word health, most places in this country, people will complete that thought for you and go immediately to health care or health services. The Affordable Care Act is an edge of the cliff conversation, and going beyond protecting and then going beyond the Affordable Care Act to try to get to universal access to high quality health care is still an edge of the cliff conversation, a very important conversation. Would that we would just join the rest of the developed world and most of the developing world in guaranteeing health, or at least healthcare, as a right and not a privilege. But even when we get there, and I have to say it's an important thing to do also, because that is how a civilized society values all of its people equally. But even when we get there, with universal access to high quality health care, because it is an edge of the cliff conversation, we can overwhelm any system if everybody is pushed up against the edge of it. So we must move into that second dimension, which I can display in a flat plane. We must be about addressing the social determinants of health, including poverty, adverse neighborhood conditions, and the like, if we want to have large and sustained improvements in health outcomes, right? If we don't want everybody just an inch away from falling off the edge of the cliff, if that fence gives. But the trick there is, if we are about moving the population away from the edge of the cliff without recognizing that we're really dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff, we're at risk of moving some of the population, but not all of the population, and actually, making health disparities worse. So we must acknowledge and address the 3-dimensionality of the cliff, address these social determinants of equity or inequity, including racism, sexism, heterosexism, capitalism, if we want to achieve social justice and eliminate health disparities. So at this point, if I were just speaking to a general audience, I might say, I've said the word racism 2 or 3 times. None of you fell off your chair. I hope that none of you guys fell off your chair. I haven't been watching because I've been talking right at you. But I do want to share, before we open it up for your questions or observations, does this make sense to you? Is it useful in your context at all? I want to share with you 3 questions that have come up before, and then we'll open it up and have a pause for discussion. First question is, if this is a useful way of understanding different levels of health intervention or educational intervention or any kind of, service thing at the bottom of the cliff. But if this is useful for understanding the different possible places that we can intervene, and if we think that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, why is it that we as a nation are spending so much money on ambulances at the bottom of the cliff? And there are many levels. I've actually, somewhere I've written down 6 different answers to that question. I'm going to share 2 with you right now. Maybe you guys want to pipe in too. But the first answer is the most obvious and perhaps the most cynical, and that is that there is a lot of money being made on ambulances at the bottom of the cliff by health systems, healthcare providers, pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, and the like. But the deepest answer, I think, is that we in this country are so narrowly focused on the individual, we don't even recognize that there's a health problem until somebody has fallen off the edge of the cliff and either is caught in our nets or falls to the bottom, and we have to scrape them off the bottom and speeds them on to care. So actually that narrow focus on the individual is one of the 7, what I used to describe as societal or cultural barriers to achieving health equity that I'm going to discuss and really love your input on in a bit. So here's another question. Why are the greenies launching themselves over the edge of the cliff? That's what some people ask when they ask, why are those people eating so much fried chicken? Or why aren't those people reading to their children? Or why are they doing this and not doing that? And this also reflects the very narrow focus on the individual, because when we as a nation are so narrowly focused on the individual, it makes the systems and structures that are pushing and maintaining the greenies near the edge either invisible or seemingly irrelevant. But that question also reflects a second of these 7 barriers to achieving health equity that I've described, and that is that we in this country are ahistorical. We act as if the present were disconnected from the past and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. The third question, most people don't ask out loud like this, but we acted in our lives, and it's sort of like this, that this situation looks fine to me. What's the problem with a 3-dimensional cliff? And we might act that question out, you know, in our lives when we leave a lovely house in a safe neighborhood, maybe even gated, right? And then we drive through an oppressed, disinvested, impoverished, environmentally poisoned neighborhood, and we end up at a safe job. And we don't feel a strong sense of urgency to intervene on that and do something about that distressed, impoverished, disinvested neighborhood that we just drove through. And that reflects a third of these 7 barriers to achieving health equity, which I now understand as the 7 values targets for anti-racism action, the endorsement of the myth of meritocracy. The story that goes something like this: if you work hard, you will make it. Now, I give you that most people who have made it have worked hard, although I also observe that not everybody who's made it has worked hard. We have some prominent examples of that right now. But even when I understand, yes, most people who have made it have worked hard, I also recognize that there are many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field, which has been structured and is being perpetuated by racism, sexism, heterosexism, capitalism, and other systems of, you know, economic systems and other systems of structured inequity. And when we deny the existence of those systems, we are endorsing the myth of meritocracy, and we are blaming those greenies for being so close to the edge. We're blaming them, in fact, for being lazy or stupid. And we ask, why don't they just take a step back, without recognizing that it may even be more slippery where they are. In fact, it's probably higher above the ground when they are, so that when they fall, they encounter worse injuries or death. So now I am going to just pause. That's just a little image. And I know you guys are like, oh, but I thought we were going to talk about racism. But this is basically to communicate to all of us who provide services. So it could be health services or community housing services or educational services or whatever kind of services that many of our communities, faith communities, provide, that it is legitimate, yes, to provide those services, but to also recognize, sometimes when I'm speaking to healthcare providers, I say, yes, be the best, fastest, you know, most in it ambulance driver you can be. But even in that, you need to wonder, is there a net above you? And how strong is the net? Is there a fence at the edge of the cliff? How strong is the fence? How close is the population to the edge? And at what part of the cliff are you even operating? And do you do things the same way, operating at different parts of the cliff? Now, I recognize in this faith community, I'm not talking to people who are concentrated and their whole identity is being an ambulance driver, but whatever our day jobs are, whatever we are doing, we should do it well. We should also recognize so that we're part of a bigger system that can make things better. And I would say that for each of us as a citizen, and not even citizen in a national way, but as a global citizen, even though our day job might be to be the best ambulance driver we can be, for each of us, I think that as a citizen, our attention needs to first be about addressing, recognizing, acknowledging, and addressing the 3-dimensionality of the cliff. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions right now, and we'll take, you know, up to 5, I would say. And if there aren't, or if there's only 2, we'll answer those. And then I'm going to go back and share you some more stuff that's going to be more specifically tools for naming racism.
So we're going to wait for Judith to send those questions to us, I believe.
And I also see, at least I can see now that I'm looking, that somebody's raised their hand. So I don't know if people want to indicate that they've raised their hands and ask the questions themselves, or ask you, Fazia, to read the questions.
Yes, thank you, Camara. I'm going to take a cue from Judith right now if she's got a question ready before I take that raised hand.
Fazia, I did send you a couple of questions in the chat. Do you see them?
Here we go. Thank you for that. I'm seeing them now. So we have a question from Eric Rothberg. What does Dr. Jones mean by capitalism as akin to racism and sexism, et cetera, et cetera?
So those are systems of structured inequities. So capitalism, so I'm not a student of capitalism, but I recognize that it's a system where some people own the means of production and other people work there, and that the profits are not shared. And so in that way, it structures opportunity. It's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value. So that's what I mean. And there are other economic systems that also do this. So there, you know, that like feudal systems with serfs and stuff like that. So capitalism is not the only economic system that does that, but it is one of them that does that.
And just to remind the audience, that particular question is on the three-dimensional cliff analogy. We're still on that.
Yes.
So we have another question from Sherry Stewart. I'm not forgetting the raised hands. Complex problems require complex solutions. Buying an ambulance is simplistic and does not begin to approach the rest of the problem. So do you agree or disagree, Dr. Jones?
Yes, I agree that that I think that if we believe that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, then all of our efforts should be kind of up the cliff and moving people away and acknowledging the different realities at different parts of the cliff and trying to change the fact that, you know, resources and populations are differentially distributed. But recognizing, for example, there was a time when I understand for HIV/AIDS, people who were doing work and making investments in different parts of the world were saying, well, should we invest in cure or should we invest in prevention? And of course, the answer is both, right? So that we need ambulances, we need nets, we need fences, we need to move the population away from the edge of the cliff. We need to acknowledge and address the three-dimensionality of the cliff and let everybody even know there's a three-dimensional cliff, because I have to tell you that the oranges that are away may not even be looking toward the cliff edge because they are not comparing themselves to people who are closer to the edge. We always compare ourselves to people who have more, who are better situated as opposed to those who have less. And that's a very important insight, so that those oranges may not even, they may say, well, I never knew that people live like that or where they were so close to the edge, because they're not even looking over there. And so we are as human beings, we need to be aware of the totality of all of us and not just be concerned about my family and trying to get more, but considering all of us as, you know, not my children or your children, but our children type of, we're all in this together thinking. Yes.
I love that, because I work with another mentor in Maryland and we were discussing it takes a village. So thank you for sharing that with us. Now, I am going to get to the people who have raised hands, but the way we're doing this is questions first. So just give me a second here. From our president of ICD, the health sector example is instructive, but perhaps not completely adequate. Because if we have had so much difficulty in addressing disparities of health due to social determinants, which are visible, would it not be more difficult to see and address disparities due to hidden racism?
So it's, what I have to say is that, first of all, people so this narrow focus on the individual is one of these 7 values targets that's hamstringing all of us. So people are, even in the health sector, are just moving to understanding the social determinants of health. We don't even have good measures, aggregate measures of health, like how close is a population to the edge. We do have income inequality. We have social cohesion, perhaps, these aggregate measures of health, but not many of them, and we don't use them at all. We just count the numbers of people in our nets and at the bottom. And we do that in terms of all of our services, because in this nation, we're very narrowly focused on the individuals. So, and then people in whatever sector you are say, well, okay, my lane is ambulance net fence. My lane in health is these health services along the edge of the cliff. And now you want me to think about moving the population away from the edge of the cliff? I can't do that. This is my lane. But what it requires is cooperation with other sectors. So recognizing that you have to cooperate with education and housing and transportation and immigration and agriculture and all of these, labor and all of these other sectors to move the population away from the edge of the cliff. And that health has a legitimate role in that, because what we can do is set agendas and convene people and say, people are falling off the edge of the cliff. So education, can you figure out your part in pushing people close to the edge or moving them away? Housing, can you figure out your part? So that is the one thing. Now, that's one part of it. That's the health part. And I actually have to say that I think even in health, we need to integrate, physical health below the head and physical health above the head, and behavioral health. So we need oral health and behavioral health and all there. Then we need to talk about the social determinants of health, housing and the like. So there's integration, there's cooperation, and then there's inclusion. When you start talking about addressing the 3-dimensionality of the cliff, now you're talking about including the populations that are differentially impacted in the first place, that are being pushed closer to the edge, investing in their work where they're already trying to solve the problems in their communities, elevating their voices, involving them at decision-making tables. So that's how I think of it, as integration, cooperation, inclusion, when you move from one dimension to the other. Now about the visible versus invisible, I acknowledge that, and I'm about to define racism. So I think I will defer. I'm about to give you a definition, and then I will generalize that definition for you to acknowledge that there are many, many different axes of inequity operating in our society today. So I've already mentioned some. So, race as the axis of inequity, racism is the system, gender as the axis, and, sexism as the system, et cetera, et cetera. And so, although I don't have my slides in there because I was trying to be short, I will acknowledge that after I define racism for you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jones. Now we're over by a couple of minutes, so I'm looking to Judith right now. I
think Manny Salone has been.
Yeah, Manny has a comment, and I had a lot more questions, and so maybe we can do one of each.
Okay, and I won't be so long in my answers.
Oh no, your answers are perfect. How can you shorten something like that? Manny, would you like to go ahead?
Surprised everybody who knows me, I got something to say. A wonderful presentation. I can't agree with you more. I might have a couple of minor quibbles with language, because sometimes people just get upset at certain terms and not knowing it. My basic comment, and I've been frustrated by a lot of this for I'm going to be 86, for a long time, and the more I learn, the more frustrated I get. Just one example, I've been a volunteer in a nursing home for ombudsman for 20 years. The situation, if any, gets worse. I don't know how much money has been poured in, well-intentioned, and you always create something, unfortunately, when there's money, unintended consequences. So what's happened, the industry started off very nice, very noble. The industry has been taken over by a lot of real estate companies. And I won't go into why real estate companies are owning nursing homes. So you pour all this money in and it's fruitless. So what gets me, we have to work on it, but for somebody once said complicated solutions need complicated answers. Unfortunately, in this country, what we get is a simplistic answer to a complicated solution, which is usually wrong. So it's the human condition. God bless you for working on it, and God bless everybody who wants to try. But it ain't easy. And I think eventually the solution would be local groups cooperating and nonprofits.
Thank you for that. And also recognizing that, that it won't have a 5-year solution or a 20-year solution, that this is intergenerational work, but that action that we have to, you know, put our shoulders to the wheel or whatever, however you want to think about it, we have to be working on it, because if we don't work on it, then it'll be 5 generations as opposed to 3.
Understood. I agree.
Yes,
Just because it's frustrating, you don't give up the fight.
that's right.
So I agree too, guys. This is awesome discussion, but I'm going to take one last question from our director of outreach in 𝐲𝐵H𝗲𝗀𝗏, Naeem Beg. Have we ever considered the neighborhood GP system practiced in many developed nations?
So I would say there was a system called community-oriented primary care that was introduced by Sidney and Emily Clark in the 1950s. They developed it in 𝗲𝗲𝗏 Township in South Africa. They were Israeli, and it was brought to the US by Jack Geiger, John Hatch, and Count Gibbs, and implemented in 2 places. One was Mount Bayou, Mississippi, and then Columbia Point in Massachusetts. It became the model for the community health centers, and now they're like the federally qualified health centers. But the model there, so it wasn't exactly like the Cuban model with the nurse doctor partnership and, you know, the you know, 2 square blocks or whatever of enrolled patients and stuff. It wasn't quite like that, but it was a health center taking responsibility for the health and well-being of a geographically defined community, and being in partnership with the community to identify problems, not just health problems, trying to address not just, you know, taking excellent care for those who presented to the health center's door, but also trying to address unmet and even unrecognized need. It often involved the hiring, training, and deployment of community health workers. It involved, you know, as you prioritize problems with community leaders and the likes, and, you know, the first problem might be, you know, they're killing our boys, and this, you know, and the second might be streetlights, and the third, and then you might get to diabetes or something like that. And so it's honoring and addressing the social determinants of health and using the stature of the health center and its employees to do all of that. It was very good. Up until the 1980s, that was like the thing. COPC, community-oriented primary care. There's even an Institute of Medicine compilation of models published in either 82 or 84. There is the Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, had another book, and then managed care, health maintenance organizations came in as an alternate population-based model. But when you have a geographically defined community, then you know, even if somebody's homeless, if they're in your catchment area, then you will take care of them. But with health maintenance organizations, then lots of people fell through the holes. And so that model is a great model. We should reinvigorate it. People think, well, what about patient-centered medical homes? That's not the same. But if we had community-centered health homes, that would be closer to the same. So it's a model that I actually, every place I found, when I taught at Harvard, I taught a course about it. You know, I learned about it in my own training in New York as a family medicine physician. When I was at CDC, I tried to get investment. You know, I keep putting that model out there. So I'm glad there was a question about it. And maybe some of you all could think about how to learn more about community-oriented primary care, and then perhaps partner with health institutions. And maybe you guys could set up a model there in Fairfax County.
And on that note, I will allow you to proceed, Dr.
Okay.
Jones.
Thank you. Thank you. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen again, and it's just a Zoom thing that the only way I know to not get stuck is to actually go to where we were, like that, and then start sharing. So now I'm going to give you some tools for naming racism, 2 allegories and some definitions. But before I even give you that first tool, the key message is when any of us starts naming racism, especially in this country, the 4 messages that we have to feel very equipped and comfortable in are, first of all, that racism exists. And I say that because there is so much staunch racism denial in this country for centuries for some people, that's a discussion point. Then beyond racism exists, that racism is a system, so that when I say the word racism, I am not trying to divide the room up into who's racist or who's not. I'm not peering and trying to say exactly how racist are you. I'm talking about a system of power, that racism saps the strength of the whole society, and that we can act. We can act to dismantle racism. So I'm going to give you some tools now to feel confident in understanding and communicating those issues. This first is my allegory, one of the teaching stories that I've developed based on something that happened in my own real life. This one I call Dual Reality, a Restaurant Saga. The moral of this story, just to cut to the chase, is that racism exists. And the thing that happened to me, come with me now, I'm going to walk you through it. As a first-year medical student, I was, of course, very diligent, very studious. And so, I woke up on a Saturday morning and I was doing what? I hit the book, studying, nose in the book, studying hard. And it came to about mid-afternoon and some friends came over. And did they distract me? Oh, no. We all got to studying long and hard, and now it's getting late and we're getting hungry and I have no food in the apartment, which was so typical of me that my friends were like, oh, okay, never mind, Camara, but we are hungry. Let's go into town and find something to eat. So we do. We walk into town and we find a restaurant and we walk in and we sit down and the menus are presented and we order our food and the food is served and here we are eating. And you're like, Dr. Jones, that's not a very illuminating story about racism. Well, no, not yet. But as I sat there with my friends, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign, and it was that sign that was a startling revelation to me about racism. So maybe I've intrigued you and you're wondering, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Oh, okay, well, what did the sign say? The sign said open. So now maybe I've lost some of you. So let me recap. Here we are sitting in a restaurant eating. I look across the room, I see a sign that says open. Thinking no more about it, I would have assumed that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that indeed the restaurant was closed due to the hour, but firmly closed, and that other hungry people, just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And that is when I recognized that racism structures open, closed signs in our society, that racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So, for example, it is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. It is difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context. But those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even, compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, why, you can even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you can say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door, let them come in? You'll make more money, and oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you'll do is pass food through the window, or maybe you'll try to tear down that sign or break through the door, but at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat, because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. So when I have about 4 or 5 minutes to talk to a group of people and help them understand that yes, racism exists, even if your whole life has screamed that this is the land of equal opportunity. This is the story that I tell. And of course, racism is not just the sign, although racism is structuring a two-sided or multi-sided sign in our society. Racism is creating a dual or multifaceted reality. But it's not just the sign, it's the sign, it's the door, it's the lock. There's lots of pieces to this system. I actually started a 3-hour conversation once with a group of people by asking this following question: how could people who are born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? And it was actually a 3-hour conversation because there are many, many ways to know. I am heartened that more people these days who were born inside the restaurant and who, you know, maybe even 6 months ago would have said, well, what are those people outside saying? Black Lives Matter? Don't they know all lives matter? Are now affirming, yes, Black Lives Matter. More of the people born inside the restaurant seem to have gotten a little glimpse of the fact that this is a two-sided sign going on, and are naming racism and putting out statements and holding, you know, workshop series, and, you know, this is great. And, you know, putting together the words systemic racism, structural racism. This is amazing. This is necessary, you know, but I have to warn us that if we go that far to naming racism, but no farther, then racism denial in our nation is so seductive that if we just say a thing, name racism, then within 6 months, we may forget why we said that thing and fall back into what I describe as the somnolence of racism denial. So we must go beyond saying a thing to doing stuff. We must move to action. We need to tear down the sign, dismantle the lock, take the door off the hinges. We must act, because if we start acting, we will not forget why we are acting. So I'm going to move from that story to define racism. And when I say the word racism, as I've already mentioned once, I'm clear that I'm talking about a system. So I am not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. I'm talking about a system of power, and a system of doing what? It's a system of doing two things: of structuring opportunity and assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured? And on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race in this society. I'm hoping that all of you are clear that race is not biology. We have mapped the human genome. There is no basis in the human genome for racial subspeciation. Race is not social class, although in this country, because of structural racism, I'll talk to you about that in a minute, we do see an association between social class and race in this country. Race is not culture, because all of these racial groups include in them many different ethnic groups with different histories, cultural histories, languages, health beliefs, health practices, you know, all of those things. But what race clearly is the social interpretation of how one looks in our race-conscious society, so that the same race that a medical admitting clerk might check off for me, that becomes part of my health record and part of a health statistic, is the same race that a taxi driver notices, or a police officer, or a teacher in a classroom, or a judge in a courtroom. And it is that race that has such profound impacts on our life experiences and life opportunities, exposures, risk, all of that. So if race is the social interpretation of how one looks, racism is the system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on that so-called race. I just want to say one more thing. And it is my observation that many people on this call will understand what I'm about to say. In this country, in most parts of this country, you look at me and I'm clearly Black. But in some parts of Brazil, you look at me and I would be just as clearly white. If you were to look at me in South Africa, I would be just as clearly colored. Here I am, same physical appearance, but the social interpretation of my appearance would assign me in those three different settings, assign me to three different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would probably take on of the group to which I've been assigned, as with my social status, as with all of this. And it's not just because of my particular appearance. For every single person in the sound of my voice, all of us, there is some other place on this earth where our so-called race would be quite different from how we are living it today. And there are many people who, you know, in one place, there's not, race is not even the thing. It's some other kind of maybe social division. And then they come here and they're racialized, or they're racialized one way here and racialized someplace else. For every single person on the planet, especially in our race conscious society, every single person in this country, there is some, even if you are living as white right now, there's some other place on this earth where your so-called race will be quite different from how you're living it today. That is the important aspect of this. And so this socially assigned race, the thing that people can assign to you from across the room or across the road, or when they cross the road to avoid you, without asking, excuse me, how do you self-identify? Excuse me, where were you born? Where were your parents born? Excuse me, may I have a little aliquot of your blood? I have a genetic hypothesis. It is that socially assigned race that is the substrate on which racism has operated historically and continues to operate day to day. And the impacts of this system of racism is that, well, when we recognize this racism exists, we understand that, yes, it's unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country, because it makes some people, especially some people who are living as white, uncomfortable. And I used to, way back in the day, I've been talking about this for 25 years, 30 years, but way back in the day, if I would sense that maybe people got a little edgy or something, I would say, oh, well, if you feel uncomfortable, shake it off, stay with me, I'll tell you some more stories. I do not say that anymore. What I say now is, if you feel uncomfortable, I encourage you to lean into that discomfort, because I have come to recognize that for each of us, the edge of our comfort is actually our growing edge. But there's a third impact of racism that many of us miss, and that is that racism saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So it's not just that Black lives matter, for example, it's that Black lives are precious. Black lives are genius and leadership and creativity and generosity and love. And when we constrain Black lives and Latinx lives and Indigenous lives and Hispanic or Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander lives, and South Asian lives, and other Asian lives, and all of these racialized lives, when we constrain these lives, either slowly by not vigorously investing in the full excellent public education of all of our children, because the blinders of racism have made some leaders think there is no genius in the barrios or the ghettos or the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. Or when we constrain these Black, Indigenous, and other people of color lives slowly by being complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many Black and brown men in our prison system. Or if we off those lives in an instant in a barrage of police bullets or with a police officer's knee, that is not just representing the loss of that humanity and genius in the individual. It's not just, forever tearing the fabric of that family through the loss. It represents a sapping of the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. I won't stay there long because I could talk even much longer into this slide. I do want to shift gears to give myself some more time for us to get to more questions. So now, I've already, I've already given you tools for 3 of the 4 main key messages I gave you for when you're naming racism. First of all, that racism exists. So you have the open close sign to talk about that racism is a system and that racism saps the strength of the whole society. Although I haven't given you a story about that, this next story will help you to do that. But I've given you the definition that helps people understand what we're talking about. Now I'm going to share with you a way I've been thinking about 3 different levels of racism, because I was trying to figure out how could racism turn into health outcomes? How could racism turn into differences in asthma prevalence between different communities? How could it turn into differences in the numbers of our babies dying before their first birthday, or the numbers of birthing families where a mother has died either in childbirth or within a year of being pregnant, the maternal mortality rate differences? How could racism turned into differences in obesity prevalence or diabetes prevalence or heart disease prevalence or kidney disease prevalence, all of these pre-existing conditions that are making it more likely if you're infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus that you're going to die from COVID-19. And so I described 3 levels of racism: institutionalized or structural, I use those words interchangeably; personally mediated, which some people might describe as interpersonal, but because I am so clear that racism is a system, I describe this as personally mediated, the system mediated through people; and then internalized. So I'm going to define each of these levels for you, give you examples of how they can impact health, and then illustrate them with another one of my allegories, my Gardener's Tale allegory. So, institutionalized or structural racism is the system, if you will. It's the constellation of structures, policies, practices, norms, values, which put together result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. Differential something by race, that's racism. Institutionalized is differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator because it's been institutionalized in our laws or customs or background norms. This is the kind of racism that shows up as inherited disadvantage or its reciprocal inherited advantage. We see it in terms of material conditions as well as in terms of access to power. So examples include differential access by race to quality housing or excellent educational opportunities or equal employment opportunities or even the same level of income at the same level of employment. And clearly those differences can impact health. Differential access to medical facilities, including physical access or financial access or even linguistic access. Differential access to a clean environment and the very well-documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus transfer stations and the like in communities of color. And with regard to power, differential access to power as information, which could be health information or even information about our own histories. Differential access to power as resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources, knowing somebody on the board. And differential access to power as voice in media, voice in government, and the like. Now, I have in the past been interrupted right about here when somebody says, well, Dr. Jones, would you take a careful look at that top set of examples that you give? You know, housing, education, employment, income. Dr. Jones, isn't that what we call social class? Why do you have that on a slide about racism? Are you talking about racism or are you really, really talking about social class? That's a very important question. I know many of you might have that question, so I'm going to answer that question. And the first part of my answer is the observation that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for example, for American Indians, the initial historical injustice was the taking of the land and the near genocide, and then moving the survivors to reserve lands, reservations, and then in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you got to pick the people up and move them someplace else. There have been centuries and centuries of families living in Mexico who never crossed the border, but the border crossed them and they find themselves in New Mexico and the other southwestern states, and their great-grandchildren right now are being harassed and vilified and targeted with the El Paso massacre. We had Chinese laborers who were brought to this country to build our railroads, unable by law to marry and unable by law to bring their families. We had Japanese Americans interned during World War II when German Americans or Italian Americans were not so treated. For people of Africa, we could go on and on for many, many different groups. For people of African descent, the initial historical injustice was the kidnapping of West African people, our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life through the Middle Passage, and then for the survivors and their progeny for generations and generations and generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But now, you know, when I start talking about that, some people have stopped me and said, Dr. Jones, there you go talking about slavery. Dr. Jones, We all recognize that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history, but Dr. Jones, the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865, and we are now in 2020, which makes that 155 years ago. So Dr. Jones, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? Well, the answer is in the question, isn't it? All else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are what I describe as present day contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating that and all of these other initial historical injustices. And these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of structural or institutionalized racism. So when you ask me, am I talking about racism or am I talking about social class? My answer is that structural or institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. This is a very important aha, right? It doesn't just so happen, not a happenstance. Now, I will also tell you that sometimes people, say, well, Dr. Jones, you're so interested in talking about race as the axis of inequity and racism as the system. You don't care much about poor white people, do you? And that is not the case. I care deeply about poor white people, poor Black people, poor Latinx people, poor Indigenous people, poor Asian people, poor Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander people, poor all kind of people. This is not like an either or. We need anti-poverty strategies or anti-racism. Actually, this is a both and. And the reason I say that is we need strong anti-poverty strategies for all of us. If you gave me a magic wand today to eliminate poverty, then ding, done. And if I could hit that magic wand twice to go beyond eliminating poverty to equalize income, I would go all the way there, ding, ding, done. But even if I were to equalize income today by race, by everything, if I did that without addressing the background structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, the mechanisms of structural or institutionalized racism, even if I equalize income by race today, within one generation, we would start to see a stratification by race in terms of income if I did not address the mechanisms of structural racism. This is not an either or proposition, anti-poverty versus anti-racism. This is a both and. And before I leave structural racism, I need to just say one more thing, which is that this level of racism occurs through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission, and very often, structural racism shows up as a lack of action, inaction in the face of need. Now, I spend a lot of time on that level, less time on the others, because that level is actually, I think, the most important for us to all understand. And it is the one because of our narrow focus on the individual that we blank on, we don't even understand, we can't even see systems and structures. But the second level, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and then the different action, the discrimination, and it shows up as police brutality, shows up as physician disrespect, physician not giving, that could be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures that patient wouldn't understand or couldn't afford or wouldn't comply or whatever it is they assume. Or it could be quite blatant, like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's history. It manifests through shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatments, where these two elements are just two examples of what some people describe as everyday racism. The microaggressions, the subtle communication of disrespect, which might be related to elevated blood pressures in communities of color, blood pressures that don't even go down at night, and teacher devaluation. That's a very important manifestation of personally mediated racism, because if a teacher looks at a young child and thinks, that child can't learn, and puts them off in the attention deficit disorder track, that child will never even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. So this level of racism, like structural, can occur through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, but even more important to recognize and understand deeply is that it can be unintentional as well as intentional. That is, you do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I'm defining here from the point of view of members of stigmatized races as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Now, I do recognize, as many of my colleagues who do anti-racism training or thinking have said, well, Camara, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people are walking around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? I agree, yes, it is. But it's not on this slide because I have not figured out how a sense of entitlement turns into negative health outcomes. However, I do recognize that maybe a sense of entitlement thwarted is at the base of what some people are describing as the diseases of despair in white populations, the suicides, the opioid epidemic. So, but it's not on this slide, not yet. Here, I am still talking from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, where internalized racism shows up as self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as, maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school or apply to that college or live in that neighborhood or try to get that job. It turns into the white man's 𝐼𝑐𝑠 syndrome, where that phrase came from my parents' generation and what it meant for them in their generation and many people of color, it still means for many of us today. So say I'm Black and I need a lawyer, you know, I might actually seek out a white lawyer over a Black lawyer. Or if I were sick, I might prefer the white doctor over the Black doctor if I could find a Black doctor. Or if my lemonade were warm, I might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the Black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Internalized racism shows up as resignation, helplessness, hopelessness. It turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, turns into not registering to vote, not voting even if you are registered. And I hope that all of you guys are really trying to get people to vote. You know, I can't say who you might vote for or whatever, but there's such intense efforts right now to disenfranchise whole chunks of our citizenry that we must resist this on all levels. So I hope that you all are voting, that your friends and family are voting, and that you get 10 other people that you don't know to vote. But I digress. Internalized racism is really about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So that when we hear young high school students of color, and one of them is trying to be the valedictorian and the others in the friend group are teasing her or him by saying, well, you know, so-and-so is just trying to be white, we need to challenge that. Because since when did white people claim exclusive access to excellence? So now I'm going to illustrate the relationships between these three levels of racism with my Gardener's Tale allegory. And I'm actually going to briefly stop sharing because I'm going to be using my hands a lot so that you can I'm going to tell the story. So first of all, I'm going to tell you the thing that happened to me in my own real life. And then I'm going to make this a story about racism. Let me just check my time. Okay, we're good. So my husband and I had been married about a year. And we were moving back down to Baltimore for me to finish my PhD at Johns Hopkins. And we bought our first freestanding house, cute little house with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted all on the porch. Now we bought the house in October, which really was not the time to plant in Baltimore. So we didn't, we held off, but when spring came, my husband, who loves to garden, ran out with our marigold seeds, going to decorate our cute little house. But then he came right back in and he said, Camara, some of these boxes have dirt in them, but some of the boxes are empty. So I need to go down to the gardening store. So he does, goes to the gardening store and he comes back hauling big old bags of potting soil. And so then we fill up the empty boxes. And then we take equal numbers of our marigold seeds and put them in all of the boxes and we water all of the boxes equally. And because I am not the gardener in the family, by this time I'm exhausted, right? So I'm just going to sit back and be delighted. Well, about 3 weeks later, as I'm walking out of my front door, I finally pay attention to these flower boxes on my porch. And what I saw made me literally stop in my tracks. Because what I saw made me think that we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus others, because some of the boxes were full of plants and the plants were tall and vigorous looking. And other boxes just had a few plants in them and they were kind of scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had bought turned out to be rich, fertile soil. So that every single seed planted in the rich, fertile soil had sprouted. The strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor rocky soil just died. But even the strong seed in the poor rocky soil had to struggle just to make it to a middling height. And some of you guys are nodding. So maybe some of you are gardeners, and maybe you've composted half of your garden, and maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes. And the image, of course, is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to take this image and I'm going to make it a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed, puts it in the rich, fertile soil, pink seed in the poor, rocky soil. 3 weeks later in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all the red seed sprouts, the strong red seed grows tall and vigorous. The weak red seed makes it at least halfway up. In that poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed dies. Here comes the strong pink seed, struggling to make it to middling height. And then in those flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, same thing happens till finally, about 10 years later, gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, I was right to prefer red over pink. So I'm going to interrupt this story there to say the first part of this story is how structural or institutionalized racism works, where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through lack of action, inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But let's pick the story back up to say, well, where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, the gardener is looking at her flower boxes and she's looking at the red flowers and thinking, oh, those red flowers are so beautiful. And then she looks at the pink flowers and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil. So she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in this garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not acknowledging or even recognizing perhaps that they're benefiting from enriched soil. Pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, but pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee into one of the pink flowers, and then to another pink flower, and then to this pink flower. And this flower's like, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is an important intervention. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, oh, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. So we have a workshop for the gardener and we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? Maybe she will, maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. If we really want to set things right in this garden, we must address the structural or institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although it makes it easier for that same gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you decide you want to keep separate boxes, then we need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious, so that in that intervention, you will have also addressed the internalized racism, because now pink won't be looking over at red thinking that red is better or wanting to be red. And in the intervention on the structural racism, you might also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers looking equally beautiful would be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate the relationships between these levels and to strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we need to at least address the structural racism. Good to address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the structural racism. And when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. But I'm going to go back into my slides for just a moment to say, there's another important question. We haven't left this story yet, because there's an important question that I haven't raised yet. And that question is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which are actually the elements of self-determination. So who is the gardener? Well, in our setting, government's a huge part of the gardener, but not the only part. You know, media, foundations, corporations, faith communities, other communities to the extent they have self-determination, but whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous. When the gardener is allied with one group, I painted her red, that's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. So now our challenge is what do we do about the gardener? Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Lots of questions that can come out of this. And I will take your questions in just a moment. But before I open the floor again, I do want to say there are two questions that I now carry with me everywhere. So I'm going to share those with you first, and then we will start turning to your questions. The first was asked of me more than 10 years ago. And it was, excuse me, Dr. Jones, but why should the red flowers share their soil? And when I heard that question, I loved that question because it showed me the power of this story to start conversations about racism that might be otherwise difficult if we were talking about racism between you and me. My answer to that question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers. It belongs to the whole garden. But here's the second question. What if that's not the original gardener we're looking at right there? What if that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Because here we are. And the great-great-great-great-grandchild has always seen the flowers looking like that, may not even think there's a problem to be solved. So in 3 quick steps, the first step is that we must make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem requiring urgent solution. We must put that on the agenda. And then step 2 is, as we say, okay, now it's on the agenda, what are we going to do? That's the naming part, but now what are we going to do? We must make those flower boxes transparent. We must be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil so that we can address the differences in the quality of the soil. Otherwise, our responses will be superficial. But the third part of the answer is, as we make those flower boxes transparent, we also need to make sure that everybody understands that the pink seed did not just go launch themselves into that poor rocky soil. So we must talk about history, and we must talk about how the gardener's initial preference for red over pink set up the whole situation. So, you know, where that initial preference, some people would call that cultural racism. In our context, it's clearly white supremacist ideology. We must address that. Because if we do not, even if we were able to compel that red gardener to enrich the poor rocky soil today until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil, if she continues to prefer red over pink, she will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So when I defined racism as a system that does 2 things, structures opportunity and assigns value, for many years when I told this story, it was all about the quality of the soil and the boxes and all that, until actually one day in the telling, I had that insight. We must address both the opportunity structure piece and the value assignment piece if we're going to set things right in the garden. So at this point, we'll have another pause for discussion. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to your questions.
Where are the questions? Dr. Jones, I am in awe, and I kept thinking of all the scenarios in my head as you were talking, and I'm like, yes, I know this situation, and I love the description of the garden, and it's just I'm sure everybody on this event today can relate to that, because we all have a situation, and you just made it so real for us. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to look to the chat real quick here.
And of course, you guys know you need to send your questions to Judith Shamir, not to me. I see that there are 4 things that may have been sent to me. Oh, okay, so I'll just read those later. But as long as it's not a question, send them to Judith Shamir.
Yeah, we do have a bunch of questions here. I don't know how much time we have left for these questions, but I wanted to ask you something before we get to the end really quickly, and then I'll jump right into the questions. I know you know why are all the Black kids sitting in the together in the cafeteria by Beverly Tatum. And in that, I had a question. The reason I mentioned that book, because you mentioned it in one of your events. And in this book, it actually says it was written in, I think Beverly Tatum wrote the first edition in 1997. And she goes, one of the responses that she got was from the white community, or maybe the privileged community, was, is this still happening? So what you're saying today in 2020 is just, I feel like I have to slap myself, you know, because this is going on and this is so necessary. So one of the questions I had, which might not be on the written chat, is how should we understand white privilege, and what do we as a society do to promote awareness about it? What's the best way? Because I know there's many ways, but.
Right, right. And so actually some of the people who, the story, the open close sign, is the first one that I use, right, to help people understand white skin privilege. It helps them understand, you know, gender privilege and all that in a very gutter way, because they can, not gutter, but deep. Not gutter. But anyway, but there are many people who are living as white who say, yeah, but I was born in Appalachia, you know, I'm poor, or, you know, oh, this, that, and the other. And I have to say that white skin privilege does not protect you from poverty. White skin privilege does not protect you from homophobia. It doesn't protect you from all of those things. Although it makes it less likely, for example, that you'll be in poverty for the reasons that I said, but it doesn't protect you from poverty or any of these things. If you are living as white, if you're living as white, you get the benefit of the doubt, you get higher expectations, you get safety in many situations, and you cannot change that. And so I sometimes recount an occurrence that happened 6 years ago, I think by now. It was in McKinney, Texas, which was just outside of Dallas. There was a group of young teens, you know, 12 and 13-year-olds. One of them was going to celebrate their birthday, and they wanted to go to a pool in one of their neighborhoods. So they go to the pool to celebrate this 13-year-old's birthday. And the people who were already at the pool that day objected and called the police. And what many of us may remember seeing is images of a white male police officer dragging a young Black girl by her hair and then sitting on her. And we saw young Black boys with their hands handcuffed behind their backs while they were sitting on the curb. And I asked people, when I recount this thing, do you guys know how we found out about that? And people were like, oh yeah, social media. But I was like, no, yeah, but how? The day after that went viral, I heard a young boy on a national television program saying, it was almost as if I were invisible to the police. He was part of the friend group. This young white boy was part of the friend group. He saw what was happening to his friends, and he could have run home for safety, right? But recognizing that his white skin made him almost invisible to the police, he stood up there and documented what was happening to his friends. So what I have to say to you is that if you are living as white in this country, your white skin privilege is going to give you lots of things, include relative invisibility to the police and all of these things. Instead of trying to deny your white skin privilege, I encourage you to use it. And to use it in all the many ways. Sometimes white people say, well, yeah, but I just feel funny. Like if I go into that neighborhood trying to be anti-racist, won't that seem funny? Well, then don't go there. Go into your neighborhood and be anti-racist. Go to the boardroom table and be anti-racist. Go to your family dinners and be anti-racist, right? So the struggle and I don't like the term ally. That's a very loose affiliation as far as I'm concerned. People talk about white allies. I think maybe compatriot, something that, because we have to recognize, yes, racism unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities and unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, but it is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And I actually think that impact of racism, we need to elevate. We need to elevate that in our media stories, in our data collection, perhaps in our religious services, in our conversations around our dinner tables. We need to do that so that it's not that you're allying with my struggle. This is your struggle too. Very important.
Thank you. So our steering committee has been busy on the chat. Our very own communications expert is asking, what reading list do you recommend? Like what books can help her? And then I have a couple more questions.
Okay, so I really think that for all of us, we need to start with history. So anything that's going to be a complete history of the United States or even the world. But some of the ones so I love Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. I love Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Isabel Wilkerson has not only The Warmth of Other Suns, which is about, Black refugees from, the South into, the Midwest and the West, but she has a new book, Caste, which I haven't read yet. So but I'm going to recommend it without that. Richard Rothstein has The Color of Law, which is about, even in the 1940s, how the FHA and VA, how the federal government actively worked to maintain racial segregation in housing. And so I think that people need to understand. There's a book that I also have on my bookcase that I haven't read by William Darity and a colleague called From Here to Equality, which is about, it's a call for reparations. And many people are like, oh my God, reparations. You'll remember even Randall Robinson decades ago wrote the book, The Debt. So maybe start with The Debt and then read William Darity's book, From Here to Equality. And many, you said, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria and other conversations about race? Well, so that's good about race relations and racial identity development in children. Many people have recommended Ibram Kendi's book, How to Become an Anti-Racist. I haven't read it yet, so I can't recommend it, but I hear it's great. Stamped from the Beginning is his book before that, which is about history. Many people are talking about Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, which I also haven't read, but she's doing good work. So just Google some stuff. But even before you get into books that are about race and racism, I would say we really need to all learn our histories. So I wouldn't go to a book about racism and how to become an anti-racist. I would go to a book of like, oh, this is really why we're in the situation we're in.
Once again, I have no words. I just love all this reading. No more TV for me. This is awesome. So we have a question from Manji. But I think it might be from your previous section. I'm not sure.
It's all right. I can still answer.
COVID-19 is widening the gap, and that was one of my questions. So he got to it before me. How can we raise awareness of the common American regarding the hurt that racism is causing for the underprivileged? I think you might have talked about this, but
well, I think so. Part of it, I will address that especially when I get, so this next section that we're going to be is going to be, so I've given you like, how do we contextualize our role in this, and that anti-racism is a legitimate endeavor for all of us. That was the clip analogy and kind of the 3 dimensions of our roles. Then I've given you tools for naming racism. The next is going to be tools for moving to action. So I will, but I have to say that I didn't answer the other question that I promised to answer. So I want to answer that question with regard to in the next section. But when I said that I was going to generalize our definition of racism to be a definition of any system of structured inequity, you could ask, what is sexism? Well, that's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And there are many axes of inequity operating in our society today, intersecting in communities and in individuals. So they include, so-called race, gender, immigration status, language, body weight, ethnicity, faith community, rural, urban, lots of different axes that I acknowledge. And all of those axes of inequity are at least risk markers for how opportunity is structured and values assigned, even as a smaller subset are actually risk factors to disease. So then sometimes people say, well, Dr. Jones, if you recognize that all of this stuff is going on, why are you so focused on race as the axis of inequity and racism as the system? Like when you recognize all this stuff going on. I do recognize all that stuff going on, but the reason I focus on race and racism is that racism is foundational in our nation's history, and yet many people are in staunch denial of its continued existence and profoundly negative impacts on the health and well-being of the whole nation. So I encourage all of us to become actively anti-racist, even as we're engaging in those other struggles, and to the extent that we're able to dismantle the mechanisms of racism, the other struggles will benefit as well. So I can't remember how I got to there, but there it is.
That's okay. I want you to finish off on your third section, but there's a lot of comments and maybe we'll send it out by email. Many comments from you know, I think that white people need to read some Toni Morrison, like Blue Eyes and Beloved, to begin to understand, you know, Black people are feeling. So there's many other comments, but I want you to continue. I'm in.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So we're going to pick up. I'm going to share my screen again. And so I have to, again, skip. Ooh, here we are. So just skip one slide now. So this is like tools for moving to action. So 4 years ago, I was the president of the American Public Health Association. And in that role, I launched our association and as many other, you know, associations, communities as would join us on a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks: to name racism, because if we don't say the whole word racism in the context of widespread denial, we're complicit with that denial. But then to go beyond naming racism, to ask the question, how is racism operating here? To identify levers for intervention, targets for action. And then once we understand potential targets for action, to organize and strategize to act. I will brag a little bit now to say that out of that campaign in 2016, in 2018, the Wisconsin Public Health Association passed a declaration at the Public Health Association level that racism was a public health crisis. And then in May of 2019, the whole Milwaukee County adopted that Wisconsin Public Health Association declaration. And that was the first of an avalanche now. So I was directly told, when I heard that Milwaukee County had made this declaration, I was so excited, and I didn't know that it was directly related to my work, but I am told by the person who at Wisconsin Public Health Association passed the declaration and then took it to Milwaukee County that it was. So this is how ideas spread. This is also the importance of agenda setting, you know, so 3 years later, right? But then in July, another state. So what I'm going to show you now are states where at least one city or county, or in 5 instances, the whole state has made some kind of declaration of racism as a public health crisis. So we had May of 2019, July, August, November, December, May of 2020. So now COVID-19 has already hit. In April of 2020, people are understanding the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. But on May 25th, there was the public lynching of Mr. George Floyd. And in June of 2020, boom. And it didn't stop there. July of 2020, more states added, September of 2020. And then even in October 2020, West Virginia added. But you guys, well, you guys aren't there yet. If all of you guys are in Virginia. So maybe that's some work that you guys could come together, is, you know, to talk to the folks in Fairfax County or in individual cities, or maybe take something to the whole state. So there are now 131 jurisdictions. So these aren't the health associations. These are the city councils or the, you know, county boards of commissioners or state legislatures or the like. There are 131 jurisdictions in 26 states that have made some kind of declaration. And as I say, it's good to name racism, but we have to go beyond that to ask the question, how is racism operating here? Which is a legitimate question, because racism is not a cloud or a miasma that we can't get a handle on. It is a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms, which are in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, which are actually different elements of decision-making, where structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table and who's not, and what's on the agenda and what's not. And I encourage any of you, when you are setting a decision-making table or find yourself at a decision-making table, your first job should be to look around and say, well, who is not here? Who has an interest in this proceeding? And then your job is not just to represent their interest, although that might be what you have to do in the short term, but actually your job is to create space, to find them a way to the table. And if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, then policies are the written how of decision-making, practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision-making, and values are the why. Here are just 2 quick examples of how you can take this question, because you could take this question How is racism operating here in my faith community? How is it operating in my workplace? How is it operating in my child's school? How is racism operating here with regard to police killings of unarmed Black and brown men and women, where identifying mechanisms like the absence of civilian review boards might be something you could work on. That's a structural piece. Or, you know, policies that rely on grand juries to indict police officers. It's not enough that there was a strafing of bullets through the apartment, right? And then somebody is dead, but that, you know, if the grand jury doesn't indict the police officer, oh, nothing happened. Or even how some states have adopted many aspects of the law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights, which make an officer who's been found liable for doing something bad in one district, that history doesn't follow them to the next district. Practices of over-policing of communities of color, which result in more accidental interaction, no-knock warrants, chokeholds and the like. The blue code of silence, maybe that's a good target. You know, that kind of normative thing, if a police officer sees another police officer doing something bad, they just didn't see anything. Well, I actually understand some police departments are now mandating, if you see another officer doing something wrong, you need to say it. And if you're there at the time and can intervene, you actually need to intervene. And then the values, which in our national values, which include the view of Black men as inherently threatening. So if a police officer says, oh, well, I fear for my life, it's like, oh yeah, it was a Black man. Okay, you're cool. And the dehumanization of people of color, which allowed that police officer to put his knee on Mr. George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I understand that that's how some people crush the life out of deer after they've been deer hunting. I don't understand it. Or how is racism operating here with regard to excess deaths of Black and Indigenous and, you know, Pacific Islander and Filipino and Latinx people of color from COVID-19, where actually the thing that's happening before we get to how is racism operating here, it's a two-stage thing happening. First, people of color are more likely to become infected because we're more exposed and less protected. And then once infected, we're more likely to die because we're more burdened by chronic diseases with less access to health care. So that how is racism operating here? Well, I don't want to stay too long because I want to have some more questions at the end and I'm rounding up on time. But in terms of structures, the racial segregation coupled with disinvestment resulting in housing segregation, educational segregation, employment segregation. So we're more in these frontline, low-paid jobs, right? Being exposed. When we get something, we go to a crowded housing situation and infect other people. We're disproportionately impacted, people of color, because we are more likely to be in prisons and jails and detention centers. We're more likely to be unhoused and the like. And also the same racial segregation coupled with disinvestment is why we have more diabetes and, you know, high blood pressure and the like, which once we're infected makes us more burdened by chronic diseases and more likely to die. Limited personal protective equipment for low-wage essential workers, limited paid sick leave and the like. The practice of where we at first, especially placed our testing centers within our whole national testing strategy, that's a longer conversation. So I just say, but our practices around testing are a big part of this. The norms of our narrow focus on the individual, ahistorical stance, myth of meritocracy, which are part of what lead us to be in such staunch racism denial, so that many people recognized when they saw all of the Black and brown and Indigenous bodies piling up so fast from COVID-19 that they couldn't be ignored or couldn't be normalized. But other people thought, oh, well, those people must be more susceptible, right? Or they just didn't think they could get it and they just, you know, it was their behaviors or whatever, as opposed to understanding that COVID-19 pulled the sheets off of structural racism in this country. And then the values, even the hierarchy of valuation that are being written into our crisis standards of care. Those are the guidelines that hospital systems or sometimes states are writing to govern when there's only one ventilator left and 10 people who need it. Who's going to get that last ventilator? Where even the existence of chronic diseases, these pre-existing conditions, is either disqualifying or putting people at lower priority for getting that last ventilator, where we are actually writing into those crisis standards of care structural racism when we do that. Another option, of course, would be using a lottery to allocate that last ventilator. So as I said, I've been thinking about First it was 3, now I have 7, they'll keep growing, but what I used to call societal or cultural barriers to achieving health equity, which I now recognize to be the 7 values targets for anti-racism action, which include the narrow focus on the individual, which I've already said makes systems and structures either invisible or seemingly irrelevant, but it also makes our self-interest very narrowly defined. We don't even include our aunts and uncles and cousins as part of self, much less those people across town. Gives us a limited sense of interdependence. There, but for the grace of God, go I. We're all in this together. I am my brother's and my sister's keeper. And a limited sense of what we can do, because we think in terms of individual efficacy. Well, how could I ever battle that system, as opposed to thinking in terms of collective efficacy. The second of the 7, our ahistorical stance. We act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. And when you are ahistorical and you're born and things are a certain way, you assume they've always been that way and will always stay that way. So it even gives you a limited idea of how systems and structures can be changed. The third, this myth of meritocracy. If you work hard, you'll make it. We talked about that, when in fact, yes, most people who have made it have worked hard, but many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field that has been structured by these systems of structured inequity. And when we deny the existence of those systems, when we deny racism, we are endorsing the myth of meritocracy, blaming people for being lazy or stupid for their situation in life. And there are many ways to deny racism. One is to say, I don't think racism exists. But another way to deny racism is to be talking about all kinds of good things. You know, you could be talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. You could be talking about cultural competence or structural competence, disproportionalities, disparities, even race. But if you talk about all of those things without saying the whole word racism, getting the ism out of your mouth, because the ism is the system piece, then if you never say the word racism in our national context of widespread denial, you are complicit with that denial. The fourth of these 7 is the myth of a zero-sum game, the story that if you gain, I lose, which fosters competition over cooperation. It masks the fact that these systems of structured inequity sap the strength of the whole society, and it hinders efforts to grow the pie. And it's almost like I'm sitting at a potluck dinner. I see you coming and I do not want you to come over here because I think you're going to eat up all the food, when in fact, you are bringing with you all kinds of cakes and pies and roasts and fruits and salads and all kinds of delicious things, but I can't even see that because I don't value you. The 5th of these 7 is our limited future orientation, where for each of us, the way that we can touch the future today is through the children and the planet. But in this country, we have a disregard for the children and a usurious relationship with the planet. And we in this country do not, as many American Indian nations do, have a 7 generations mentality when we're doing decision making. We don't think, what is the impact 7 generations hence? And we do not, like I'm told Maasai people do, greet each other. Like they don't say, hey, how you doing? They ask, how are the children? And they hope to hear the answer back, all the children are well. We don't even ask, how are the children? And if we did, we would not get the answer that all the children are well. The 6th of these 7 is the myth of American exceptionalism. The myth that in the United States, we are so, and see, you notice it's not even US exceptionalism. We in the US have grabbed America to be us, when in fact there's North, Central, and South America, right, who are all American. But we in the US are so, the myth that we're so special, so unique, so ordained by God that the usual rules don't apply to us. We can't be held accountable. We shouldn't even be interested in what's going on in other parts of the world. And furthermore, that there's nothing that we could learn from other nations. And if only we could learn from what other people have been doing around COVID-19, so many tens of thousands of lives would have been saved. And the 7th of these value targets is white supremacist ideology, which I do not use as a lightning rod term. I use it as the description of the false idea of a hierarchy of human valuation by race. There is no such hierarchy, but this false idea that there is, and the false idea that if there were, that white people would be at the top as the ideal or the norm. But this white supremacist ideology is the foundational value in our, you know, and I talked about racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value. It's the first, even though I have it here, it's the 7th of these value targets. It makes people who are living as white, it gives some of them, some of you, a sense of entitlement. It results in the dehumanization of people of color and fear at the browning of America, the fear that's underlying a lot of our political divide today. It is actually, racism not only saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources, it does that by dividing us from one another and dividing people from their own interest, their own self-interest. So what can we do today? We're going back to the image of the restaurant. We have to actively look for evidence of two-sided signs. Is there something differential going on here? by race, by gender, by immigration status, by language, by faith community, by rural, urban, by anything, not just in terms of outcomes, but also in terms of opportunities. We cannot be satisfied that we look over it and say, oh, it looks open to me. We need to burst through our bubbles to experience our common humanity. And this is where faith communities are doing it, have the opportunity to do something really important, and where you all as an, interfaith communities for dialogue are doing it right now. All of us live in a bubble. Some of the bubbles that we live in of our experience, our children's school and all like that, are big bubbles with thin soap bubble boundaries. Some are smaller bubbles with thicker plexiglass boundaries. And sometimes we're tinting the boundaries, and sometimes we're polarizing them. But whatever kind of bubble we're in, very often we do not recognize that just across town, there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are, who are living in very different circumstances. We need to burst through our bubbles, either as individuals or as communities, create opportunities so that we can experience our common humanity in different circumstances, and then build common cause. We need to be interested in the stories of others, believe the stories of others, and join in the stories of others. We need to develop a sensitivity to seeing the absence of who is not at the table, what is not on the agenda, what policies are not in place that are put in place could be quite productive. We need to reveal inaction in the face of need, because that's how structural racism most often manifests these days. But all of the power is not just on the side of those who are inside the restaurant. Those of us on the outside need to know our power, to recognize that action is power, and especially that collective action is power. So I have been delighted to share this with you. We have just a few minutes, so to take other questions, and then I apologize in advance, but I need to transition to another talk at 6 o'clock.
Yes, Dr. Jones, I mean, you packed in so much, and action is power. That's the best way I can take everything you just said in the last few seconds and say, action is power, and what we're doing, the willingness to get uncomfortable. Like, get through our bubbles and the willingness to get uncomfortable. We get too comfortable. We have to be able to get uncomfortable, and action is power. I don't know what to say to you. I have a couple of questions. I don't know if you have time, maybe just some short, brief.
Sure. I'll do quick answers.
So comment is, you said that when addressing issues of racism and forming groups to address these issues, we should look at who isn't in the room. What if the person of color or other disadvantaged groups don't want the presence of white people on their committees, groups, organizations, or governing bodies of anti-racism groups, since we're being blamed for the total situation?
So I didn't say that. So I was saying when we have decision-making bodies that we should look and see who's not at the table. Most often, the people who have the power are white people, and they don't want other people to come because they don't want to share the power, or they think that those other people, that might be nice, it might diversify, be a pretty picture, but they don't actually believe that there's value that's going to be brought to the table, because they think that they know everything that they have to know right there, right? They don't understand that there's more insight, more genius, different lived experiences that can bring value. I did not say that people of color, I think all of our, that we need to do what some people call, I can't think of what they call it now, but like similarity groups to talk about racism, as well as intergroup conversations. So I am not saying that every conversation, and I wasn't really talking about this in terms of our anti-racism work. We have to each do our anti-racism work the way that we can. But I wasn't saying that Black people have to teach white people, for example. I'll just say that I do not think that Black people have to teach white people about racism. I think white people can start digging and learning and get their own resources to learn about racism. I think that intergroup conversation is always good, but I'm not putting the burden, nor would I say that we have to let people touch our hair. Like we don't have to do that. So.
Oh, they couldn't touch my hair because I'm covered, but just wanted to throw out at you that if you have time for a second question,
sure.
When resources are unlimited, it is easier to convince those with power and privilege to give rich soil to those who are living in rocky soil. However, how do we convince those with white privilege to take action to improve the soil when it means they have to share limited resources? especially when they don't acknowledge that the rich soil doesn't really belong
to them. Right. So it's a thing of, I think that if we get people working together, that the red flowers will recognize that they are missing something from not sharing that soil with the pink flowers. They're missing all of the genius there, but they're also missing interactions and stuff like that. So I think it is hard to convince people to give up something, but I think that the sharing of the soil is not giving up, it's improving the whole garden. And if you have a red gardener, the red gardener will never even let the red flowers believe that. But so maybe it really is, we have to change the gardener. Our red gardener doesn't even care what the garden committee that's judging, you know, the contest thinks as they go down the street, right? They don't even care. But there are other models where the flowers are sharing their soil and everybody is enriched by that. So
everybody's enriched listening to you today, Dr. Jones. I want to thank you so much. I am so delighted to meet you and hear. I hope to see. Yes, I hope to see you in the near future very soon. Judith wanted to say a few words, so I'm going to let her end the portion with you.
And thank you all. Yes, thank you.
So listen for Judith.
Well, Camara, I don't want to delay your going on to your next presentation. I don't envy you having to go from one to the other, but it's been a delight working with you on preparing for this. And this has just been a tremendous session. It's so rich and there's so much to think about. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all. I hope that that I have given you things that you can continue and enrich, and then stay in touch with me and let me know.